This session is going to look at the supply and future supply potential in the Americas. Again, it is important to think through these aspects with regards to the future global situation. Certainly with the increasing population, certainly with changing incomes, the demand for food is going to change over the next 20 or 30 years. What this session is going to do is it's going to provide a little bit of a discussion in terms of where we are from a landmass perspective and where the potential is for perhaps increases. Then we're going to take a look at crop production. We're going to look at maize or corn. We're going to look at soybeans. We're going to take a look at wheat. We're going to take a look at rice. Then we'll look at the livestock side, looking at cattle, dairy, milk production, pork, and poultry. And then we'll finish up with some future expectations. The data that I'm going to use for this presentation come from FAO Stat, which has a good source of information. In some respects, I think it's good to take a look at the global arable land mass in terms of this has a look at where we've been from 1961 through 2017. And so essentially you can see that we're down about 1.25, 1.27 billion hectares of land in 1961. Generally that had an increasing trend until about 1985, 1986. From there it had a slight decreasing trend to about 2007. Since 2007 we've had an increase where we're just a little bit under 1.4 billion hectares of land. And so certainly there are estimates from the FAO that we need 120 million hectares. And so can we get up to that 150 million hectare range over the next 30 years? Certainly is a question that we're going to look at. If you look at the arable land situation globally, essentially you look at the top 10 countries. The U.S. and India are very close with 11.35% and India 11.25%. Russia and China are very close with 8.75 and 8.55. Then it falls quite a bit to Brazil at 4%, Argentina 3%, Canada 3%, and then you have 2% for Pakistan, Ukraine, and Nigeria. If you just look at the Americas, and what I'm going to do is look at 3 countries in North America, 3 countries in South America. Essentially, I'm looking at the U.S., Brazil, Argentina, Canada, Mexico, and Paraguay. In terms of looking at this, again, you see the same numbers on this pie chart as you did on the other, where United States has 11.35%, Brazil has 4%, Argentina 2.8%, Canada 2.8%, Mexico has 1.7% of the arable land, and Paraguay has 3.5% or 0.35% of the arable land. Just looking at these top 10 countries over the period of time, certainly you can see some changes with regards to that. But again, to give you the difference in terms of essentially this line here is the U.S., and then if we look at the next line, which is Brazil, we're down here. And then essentially you can see Argentina and Canada in these. This line here is Argentina, and then Canada is this line here. And so certainly you can see the relative change of those over time. With regards to this, in terms of there's information that basically says that Brazil, you could add roughly 150 million hectares by converting pasture, by bringing a little bit more land in from the Cerrados region, bringing in a little bit more land from the Amazon region. The U.S. in some respects has about 12.5 million hectares in CRP. And so if need be, that land might be able to be brought in. And since some of that land was taken out, the methods of production are much more environmentally sustainable than they were previously. Let's move on to taking a look at crop production. And this looks at the aggregate production of the United States and the countries in the region. One of the things to look at is from a corn perspective. The United States produces 34% of the world's corn crop. These numbers are 2018, and so the most recent numbers we have is 2018. Brazil produces a 7%, Argentina 4%, Mexico and Canada and Paraguay you can look at. But roughly half the corn crop is produced in the Western Hemisphere, and by far the United States is the dominant producer. If we look at the soybeans, it's even more, where essentially the rest of the world produces less than 15%. That means the Western Hemisphere produces 85% of the corn crop, or of the soybean crop. Looking at this, you have 35% in the U.S., 34% in Brazil, 11% in Argentina. And then you certainly see the Paraguay, Canada, and Mexico numbers. But in terms of looking at that, certainly there's huge concentration of production in the soybean, much more so than corn. And corn is pretty concentrated in the Western Hemisphere. One of the things I think to conclude from this is the world is going to come to the Western Hemisphere for soybeans. And it's very likely that the world is going to come from to the Western Hemisphere, particularly the U.S. for corn production. If we take a look at the other two crops, essentially here we have wheat. You can see that the U.S. produces about 7% of the wheat, Canada about 4%, Argentina 2.5%, but the Western Hemisphere only produces about 85% of the wheat. And so while wheat can be important in certain states, certain regions of the Western Hemisphere, overall it's a relatively minor crop in the Western Hemisphere compared to the world. And then if we look at rice, it's basically 3%. And so again, you can see that rice in some respects is not that important in the Western Hemisphere. And so if you look at that, certainly I think there are important aspects to consider. What we've done here is basically we're going to take a look at each of the crops with regards to the acres harvested, the yield, and then we're going to end up taking a look at the livestock after that. In terms of looking at this, big dominance in terms of the U.S. in terms of area harvested. Again, that's been generally increasing from about 23 million hectares to currently about 33 million hectares, but a strong increase. The other country that has a strong increase, especially since the 1990s, is essentially Brazil, where you've end up seeing a growth from maybe 11 to 12 million hectares to over 16 million hectares. One of the things I think it's important to realize about Brazilian production is that that is the second crop of a double cropping system, where the first crop is soybeans. And so I think that's very important to consider as we begin to move forward on this, is that because it is the second crop of a double crop, I think you can kind of think of that as the wheat soybean double cropping system, where you're going to see a lot lower yields than you would if you have a full season soybean crop as opposed to a double crop. I think the same thing occurs there within South America, where corn is a second crop as opposed to primary crop. If you look at the area, certainly Mexico has been fairly level over time. You've seen a little bit of increase over the last decade or so in the area harvested in Argentina, and so Argentina appears to be shifting more of its land mass to corn production. And then if you look at Canada and Paraguay, they seem to be fairly stable. If you look at the yield, you'll see one of the things that the U.S. and Canada, in some respects, they're kind of neck and neck. U.S. is usually bigger than Canada in terms of yield, but certainly there are years where they will switch. Again, you're moving from a situation where essentially there were 40 million hectograms per hectare. The U.S. is fairly close to 120 hectograms per hectare. One of the things that's been interesting is over the last 3-4 years, essentially Canada has dropped their yield from above 100,000 hectogram per hectares down to about 95-96%. In terms of, you look at Argentina, again, they had been making a pretty drastic increase in yields for a period of time, although it seems to have leveled off over the last decade, and essentially the last 2017, 2018, there's actually been a little bit of a decline in yields, and so it'll be interesting, obviously, to see if that pops back up. And then you have the yields in Brazil, Paraguay, and Mexico. Again, you have seen some increase both in the yields of Paraguay and Mexico. However, again, they're still quite a bit less than what you're seeing in the U.S. And again, part of that may be from the double crop. In terms of looking at Argentina, that's usually produced in a single crop or a single year growing season, and so you do see a little bit more there. To summarize, market share, 50% of the corn crop is produced in the Americas, 34% in the U.S., 7% in Brazil. Again, in terms of area harvested, there's more of U.S., Brazil, and Argentina going into corn production. In terms of productivity, Argentina and Brazil lag the productivity of U.S. and Canada. Argentina and Brazil are making gains, though the last couple years the crops have not been quite as good in Argentina and Brazil. And looking at that, there's a big difference with regards to yield in Brazil versus Argentina. Argentina has much higher yields. Let's jump into soybean production in terms of the area harvested. In some respects, the U.S. has moved from about 10 million hectares to about 35 million hectares. At the same time, roughly, Brazil from 61 to 71 basically produced very little. Then they had a fairly steady growth rate up until about 2000, and then that growth rate basically increased again. And if you look at it from an acres harvested perspective, the U.S. and Brazil are very close. The U.S. is a little bit over 35 million hectares. Brazil is a little bit under 35 million hectares. In terms of Argentina, you see that they had a steep rise, although that has fallen off the last couple years, again with regards to shifting crop mix. And then you see the production in Paraguay. There's been some steady increase in Paraguay, steady increase in Canada, and then Mexico is fairly level. In terms of the yield, probably the big thing here is early on there was a distinction between the yields, especially of the U.S., Canada, and Mexico compared to what they were in Argentina and Brazil. However, now if you look at it, you can see that there's just a lot of interrelationship. And so unlike corn, where there's a lot of separation, other than Mexico, essentially the yields are very competitive. Certainly there'll be years with drought and other weather and climatic conditions that are going to affect the yield, and certainly you see bigger variability in Paraguay, in Argentina, than you have seen, for example, in the U.S., Canada, and Brazil, but that is there. So to summarize, basically, 85% of the soybeans are produced in the Americas, 35% in the U.S., 34% in Brazil, 11% in Argentina. In terms of, there are fairly large increases recently in the area harvested in the U.S., Brazil, and Argentina. And essentially there had been substantial gains in Brazil and Argentina, though Argentina has reduced its acres over the last six harvests. Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay yields are essentially identical to the U.S. and Canada. In some respects, if you look at those graphs, the productivity growth is smaller in the soybean sector than it is in the corn sector, and that's one of the things that'll be interesting going forward, whether or not additional productivity growth in the soybean sector can be achieved to keep up with what we're seeing in corn production. Moving on to wheat, one of the things to look at in terms of, from a U.S. perspective, you see a decline. From Canada, you see a decline. In Argentina, you see a decline, except the last couple years where you've seen an increase. And so generally, wheat is becoming less important from an area harvested. Again, the U.S. at one point was up above 30 million hectares of harvest. Now it's closer to 15. So essentially, we've allocated about 50% of the acres harvested out of wheat. In terms of Canada, essentially they've went from about 15 to 10, and so they've reallocated roughly about a third of their acres. More recently, Argentina fell, but they have increased quite a bit over the last couple years with regards to harvest. In terms of the yield, one of the things you'll see is Mexico is quite a bit higher. Part of that is just the fact that much of their wheat is irrigated. And then if you look at the other three countries, essentially the yields in some respects are similar, although it seems like Paraguay and Brazil are lagging a little bit the yields that you see in Argentina, Canada, and the U.S. And so certainly that I think is important to note. Also, if you kind of look at where we are in terms of the yields, in some respects for the U.S., we're kind of 17, 18 hectograms per hectare. Essentially, we have essentially increased those, not quite doubled them, but essentially, again, if you compare the percentage increase in corn yield increase compared to wheat and soybeans, you'll see much more increase in the corn yields. 15% of the wheat is produced in the Americas, with roughly 7% in the U.S. The big thing there is declining area harvested in the U.S. and Canada, a little bit more stability in Brazil and Argentina. Mexico yields are higher than other countries, seems to be fairly slow productivity growth. It'll be really interesting to see whether or not hybrid wheat catches on and whether or not that can really increase the productivity. Big issue there with regards to productivity and needing to increase the yield potential in order to get the profitability of wheat up with corn and soybeans in much of the U.S. The last one, and if you look at the areas of rice harvested, the previous graphs were kind of in the 35-40 region in terms of the million hectares harvested. In terms of rice, essentially all of these are kind of in 6 or below, and so essentially you can see just how relatively unimportant rice is in the Western Hemisphere. Brazil, basically, they've are growing about a third of the rice than what they did in the late 70s, early 80s. In some respects, the U.S. has been pretty flat, essentially since 1973. And then you also can see that Mexico, Paraguay, and Argentina, rice is relatively unimportant. In some respects, Canada doesn't grow rice, and so I did include it on the graph just to have the same color scheme, but there is really no rice in Canada. In terms of yield, the U.S. does lead in yield. You've seen an increase of roughly 40,000 hectograms per hectare to about 86,000 hectograms per hectare, and so there has been an increased yield there. It was pretty flat in Argentina for a number of years, and that has then increased since about the mid-1980s. Seen some yield increases in Brazil, and seen some yield increases in both Paraguay and Mexico. The key thing, though, is rice is relatively unimportant in the Western Hemisphere. About 3% is produced in the Americas. Large declines in areas harvested in Brazil. Pretty much everybody else has been stable at small numbers. Fairly good gains in yield, but it's not a strong support source of the world supply. The Western Hemisphere is really a minor player in the production of wheat. Again, looking at that, roughly the arable land in the Western Hemisphere was roughly 23%. In terms of the productivity of wheat, or the amount of wheat produced and the amount of rice produced, are well below the 23% at 15% and 3%. However, if you look at corn and soybeans, with 23% of the land, we're producing 50% of the corn and 85% of the soybeans. And so it does give a little bit of an indication in terms of what the land selection is. Switching to livestock, essentially, first we're going to look at beef and milk. In terms of looking at this, the rest of the world produces 57% of the beef and 76% of the milk. And so that means the Western Hemisphere produces 43% of the beef and roughly 24% of the milk. If you look at the production by different regions, and again, these are 2018 numbers, 18% of the beef is produced in the U.S., 15% in Brazil, 5% in Argentina, and then you see 3%, 2%, and 1% in Mexico, Canada, and Paraguay, respectively. In terms of milk production, essentially the two major players there are the U.S. and Brazil. The U.S. has about 14.5% of the world's milk supply. Brazil has about 5%, and then about 2% for Mexico, 1.5%, and 1% for Canada and Argentina. And then you see Paraguay's numbers there. If we look at essentially pork, essentially about 17% of the pork is produced in the Western Hemisphere in 2018, and roughly about 37% of the world's chicken. Again, looking at that, the U.S. produces about 10% of the world's pork. It'll be interesting to see with kind of the swine disease, African swine flu in China, whether that number increases, especially from the Western Hemisphere. Brazil produces about 3%, Canada 2%, and then less than 1.5% for Mexico, Argentina, and Paraguay. Poultry, the U.S. produces 17% of the world's poultry supply, 13% in Brazil, 3% in Mexico, 2% in Argentina, and then 1% in Canada, and very little in Paraguay. Focusing on beef, one of the things you'll end up seeing is there is a slight decrease in the number of animals harvested, and these are million head. In the U.S., it had been around 40 million head. We're probably 33, 34 million head, and it did dip in 2015 to about 30 million head. This is a contrast to what Brazil essentially moved from about 10 million head to about 40 million head, and since roughly 2005, it's kind of leveled off around that 40 million head. And so while the U.S. does produce more cattle, it actually harvests fewer. And so from a production perspective, more quantity of beef is produced in the U.S., but certainly the number of cattle harvested is less in the U.S. than it is in Brazil. If we look at Argentina, I'm not sure you can see any trends there. You see a little bit of an increasing trend in Mexico, fairly level in Canada, maybe a little increase since the 2000s in Paraguay. But again, from a relative perspective, the cattle are going to reside in the U.S. and Brazil. With regards to the yield, what's kind of interesting is that at the beginning of the period in the 1960s, the hectograms per animal were fairly similar in terms of looking at 16, 17 to 2200. But essentially you've seen a big increase in terms of the scale of pounds of meat produced per animal in the U.S. Essentially, it's increased from about 2,200 to about 3,700. Canada was following pretty closely, and then there's a big dip there, although that has recovered the last couple of years. And so looking at essentially where we are in terms of Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, essentially they're less than 25 hectograms per animal. And so essentially there's a pretty big difference there with regards to the amount of beef produced, essentially about 1,000 hectograms per animal. And so the scale of animals of meat produced in other countries other than the U.S. and Canada and the Western Hemisphere is roughly probably about 60% per animal of what's produced in the U.S. In terms of market share, 43% of the beef is produced in the Americas, 18% in the U.S., 15% in Brazil. Basically, increases of number of cattle harvested in Brazil, though it has leveled off since 2006. Stable or declining in the rest of the Americas, though U.S. increased recently. The U.S. has roughly 50% more yield per animal. The U.S. has a fairly stable yield. Canada has been increasing yield in the last few years, while others have been more stable. We now shift to milk production in terms of looking at the milk cows. Again, you had seen a fairly big increase in Brazil, although about since 2013 that has declined. Again, they're running about 16, 17 million milk cows. In some respects, the U.S. was up about 17 million, fairly dramatic increase, and then continuing slowing increase, or slowing decrease, we're down about 9 million. And so, in some respects, roughly half of what the number of milk cows are in Brazil. If you look at the other 2, 3, 4 countries in terms of Canada, Paraguay, Mexico, Argentina, not much in terms of trends with regards to the number of milk cows. It seems to be fairly stable per country, maybe a little bit of decrease in Canada, where they've went from 3 million to probably 1.5 million, but relative to the milk cows, just much lower there. In terms of milk produced, you'll see big productivity differences there. In terms of, again, looking at this, we're probably about 33,000 hectograms per cow. Now we're up over 100 to about 104 hectograms per cow. Pretty steady increase there with regards to what's going on with productivity. If you look at the productivity in Brazil, you see that it's incredibly low compared to all the other countries in the region. Paraguay has been fairly flat. We have seen some increasing productivity in Argentina, and then a little bit of increase in Mexico. Canada had a pretty good increase until it flattened out, and then essentially 2018, the productivity in terms of milk produced per cow dropped precipitously. 24% of the milk is produced in the Americas, 14% in the U.S., 5% in Brazil. Essentially, increases in cow's milk in Brazil basically is about 121% above what it was, and so they've more than doubled their herd, although it's been decreasing since 2011. Basically, the U.S. has decreased the number of cow's milk by 45% over this 50-year period. Productivity is about 100% more per animal in all but Argentina, where the advantage is about 60%. U.S. and Argentina are increasing yield dramatically. U.S. for a number of years, Argentina more recently. Canada has decreased the other last 2 years, while the others are more stable. Turning to pork, again, big difference in terms of the number of head harvested. In some respects, it had been running in the low 80s. That now is essentially increased by about 50% since the 1990s. In terms of Brazil, again, the same type of pattern, and then it has increased, and so they've went from probably about 16 million head to about 40 million head, and so they've more than doubled their kill per year. You see a little bit of increase in Canada, not near as much in Brazil or in the U.S. A little bit increase in Mexico. Pork, in some respects, is relatively unimportant in terms of the amount of animals harvested in Argentina and Paraguay. In terms of the hectograms per animal or the yield, you don't see near the difference that you see in milk or beef production. Essentially, they're all probably within 200 hectograms per animal. Again, Canada has actually surpassed the U.S. at about 1,000 hectograms per hectare. The U.S. has been fairly flat, kind of in the upper 900s, mid 900s. And then you see that certainly Brazil in Argentina are approaching 900, and so maybe about a 10% difference in Canada, maybe about a 8 or 9% difference in the U.S. with regards to the amount of meat produced per animal. Summarized, 17% of the pork is produced in the Americas, 10% in the U.S., 3% in Brazil. General increase in the size of animals harvested in terms of the numbers, but also the size. Much larger than the rest of the region in terms of the U.S. produces or harvests about 3 times the number of animals than any of the other countries. General increase in yield per animal, not the difference in yield per animal that you see on the bovines, whether or not that be beef or whether or not that be milk. Poultry, we'll finish up with poultry. Again, huge increase, and this is the number of chickens harvested. Basically, it was a little over 2 billion in the 1960s. Now in the U.S. we're above 9 billion. Brazil, huge growth from 1 billion to roughly 6 billion, roughly from 1979 to 2018. And so if we look at that 40-year period, they've increased 6 times the number of birds harvested. You see a little bit bigger increase coming in Mexico. It seems to be separating itself from Canada and Argentina and in Paraguay. Less than 1 billion birds harvested in Argentina, in Canada, and then in Paraguay. Looking at the yield, one of the things that is interesting in terms of the birds are a little bit bigger in Argentina and in Brazil. Again, this is the hectograms of carcass weight produced per animal. Again, about 30 hectograms per animal per chicken in Argentina, about 23 in Brazil. And if you look at U.S., it's probably about 21, 22 in there. In some respects, I'm not sure about the numbers of Paraguay. I don't think those numbers are very meaningful. It just kind of sits on this 10,000 per bird, and I think you would see some change over that. But again, to maybe summarize, 36% of the poultry chicken is produced in the Americas, 17% in the U.S., 13% in Brazil. Rapid increase in the number of birds harvested. The U.S. is much larger than the rest of the region, basically 50% more birds harvested than compared with Brazil. General increase in yield in animal, not much difference per chicken, though Argentina and Brazil does harvest bigger birds than the U.S. To maybe summarize and just think a little bit about where the future may be. Again, the Americas represent 23% of the world's arable land. With regards to that, the Americas are the important world producers of maize and soybeans, and so with the incredible amount or percentage of production of soybeans and maize, it's going to be hard for the rest of the world to ignore the Western Hemisphere to meet those needs. They're less important in terms of wheat and rice, looking at 15% of wheat, 3% of rice. In terms of the livestock sector, again, important producers, 43 and 36% of beef and chicken, 24 and 17% of milk and pork, respectively. One of the things that'll be interesting to look at is, will that pork increase? Again, China has dominated the production there for a number of years, and will that increase over time? Again, a lot of numbers and a lot of information provided, but hopefully this gives a little picture of the relative importance of this. It really is important to have a broad understanding of where the production is, where that supply is going to be. Certainly there's going to be geopolitical implications with regards to supply and demand, and certainly producing a bulk of the corn and soybeans and beef and chicken are going to put those sectors probably in a different footing than perhaps we'll see in the dairy and the pork industry. Although the pork industry is probably one industry that could change fairly rapidly. With that, thanks for your attention. Hopefully this has been of some benefit in terms of kind of giving you a general picture for the production in terms of regions of the world.